shout that is still just an intake of breath, straining so hard your imagination. Becomes a microphone for the future. A new voice starts to come unjammed against a run of white noise, floods, colognes, nostalgias that rhyme. When kilties went roaring over the grass, fell in it, let it grow through them. You pick up words moving towards or away. Reaction times quicken. Is that it? Listen, not to dour centuries of trudging, marching and taking orders. Today I have heard the feet of my country breaking into a run. Robert Crawford, well named. Named after the shortbread tins of they're the images of the more famous Robert. Robert Crawford is a really fine poet, somebody who we can travel with for the rest of our lives. He's someone who's extremely funny, unlike me. I'm a residue of that duo Scotland that we're all busy trying to leave behind while remaining serious about certain things. If you get a chance, one of Robert Crawford's most funny poems is called Burnswear, and it's about the 5th Minister opening the 14th in a chain of places that sell shortbread tins and images of Robert Burns. And it is genuinely, its closing lines are extraordinarily funny. Another of his poems, which is dedicated to his mother, is called Opera. But it's actually about her sewing machine. And that is, for me, one of the greatest poems I've ever read. And I will travel with Robert Crawford for the rest of my life, happily and with hope in my heart, about the causes that all the Roberts and all the Robertas have beating in their hearts. The idea that we can live in a dignified, free, democratic country where democracy means that people have a meaningful contribution to make and there's spaces in their lives where they can make those contributions. And it is worth putting up with any amount of setbacks to make a step forward towards these goals. And always there will be problems in societies. They're made up of problems, but we're sick of problems. We need solutions to problems, and we need solutions that come from and return to the vast majority of people. The original idea of democracy is a very ancient one. It involves having a space where people can speak freely and where they can express themselves. But it also means a place where there is real equality, not some equality that you occasionally get before the law, unless you happen to be from the lower ends of the working class, who seem to occupy, according to Craig, when he came out of Salvo prison. It seemed that virtually the entire population were from 2 or 3 Edinburgh housing estates. I was born in one of them. I was born in England, but I grew up on a housing estate where there were many, many fine people called Drylow. It's still a happy place, and I'm always happy to drive past it or go back there. So I started with a poem, and I'll probably end with a poem, if you can stand it. I also wanted to say that this is not my first time in Salvo or Stennismuir. I came here a long time ago, in 1986, and I came to look at conditions in a hospital called the Royal Scottish National Hospital. That wasn't its original name. It didn't have the Royal decanted into it. It was the Scottish Hospital for Imbecile Children in its original foundation. And I noticed from consulting that well-known website, Google, that its records have now been handed over to UNESCO as part of the world memory. Well, I'm hopeful that the records that have been handed over bear some relation to the realities of that hospital. came here shortly after visiting another hospital called Lennox Castle, and living in Lennox Castle for a while, to look at the conditions in that hospital. And I don't know whether I'm happy or otherwise, but apparently Lennox Castle has been closed, and it's now mainly something past on the way to the Celtic training ground. Here, the Forth Valley Hospital has replaced RSNH, it's the same site. But when I came here in 1986, what I found was that, thanks to the appalling cuts of an earlier version of austerity, there was a unique situation. Carl Stairs was overflowing with dangerously criminal people, for whatever reason we don't know. But some genius had the idea of saving money by opening up the RSNH, a wing that was underused as a place where the criminally insane could be decanted from Carstairs. And what we found when we looked into it was that there were a whole number of suspicious deaths that had taken place, which I'm sure have not been recorded in the UNESCO memory of the Royal Scottish National Hospital. The conditions in there were appalling, and not just for the inmates, but also for the staff. And the staff at all levels, psychiatrists, doctors, nurses, were living in a society that was inflicting austerity on its most marginalised and defenceless people, which tells you that it's a society that should be ashamed of itself. And we come from Lennox Castle, where we've lived for a good many nights and days, and I will never forget what we recorded on film on that day, the last day. There was a wee man in the hospital, young, about 30, and he was working with a music therapist, and she was trying to get him to say his own name. And she was sitting at a piano, and she would play a few notes, and she was trying to get him to say, Robert, Robert. I apologise for the singing quality, but she was more musical than me. Robert, Robert. And as if on cue for the cameras that we were working with, he sang his own name. Now, maybe I was the victim of a PR stunt. I don't think so. I think it was an entirely genuine and happy accident that it happened. It was as a result of her hard work. And because I knew that the hospital was in free fall, deprived of money, deprived of resources, and I can tell you some of the things that are around there are so appalling that it was a pleasure to go and investigate gulags and South African gold mines, which are also hideous places. So I asked this woman, what's your next step in Robert? And there was a long pause, and she said, oh no, I'm being made redundant. I'm used to being embarrassed. I've got children and grandchildren who remind me of my inadequacies. Anyway, that's the story of Lennox Castle, and that's the story of austerity as it was in the Thatcher years, when massive amounts of resources and money were being transferred from the north to the south, from the having unions dismantled and having all sorts of good measures, special measures put upon them. So, I've been in Salvo before, and I'm sorry I haven't been back before now, and I feel guilty that I never had the time or never took the time to more properly investigate what happened to those suspicious guys, and those people whose lives were being ruined by the deliberate policies of the government, the deliberate policies of the government of Irish people, greedy people. I can probably manage without getting So, why are we here? Well, we're here because of a lady who's a humble person, who's sitting on my left. And I need to say a few words about Sarah. I'm sure she'll find this excruciatingly painful. And she'll give me 6 to the belt double-handed later on. Anyway, Sarah, I got to know slightly because of Alan Knight. Alan Knight is the man who made this wee film called London Calling, which is a wonderful film. A wonderful film, not about poetry, but about propaganda. Poetry is the opposite of propaganda. Poetry is life-giving. Propaganda is mind-fixing. It's trying to prevent you from thinking for yourself. Alan Knight told me about this lady who suspected there might even have been some vote fiddling in the referendum. This is Britain. We don't fiddle votes in Britain. Unless we're in Northern Ireland, the old slogan, vote early, vote often. Particularly, anyway, let's not go into that. So, I got in touch with Sarah, and soon learned that actually she was an award-winning filmmaker and had made very important films about 2 catastrophic events in recent history. One was a nuclear leak in a place called Dounreay, which has been covered up, and the other one was a disaster killing many, many people, hundreds of people, called Piper Alpha, where there had been an official inquiry. Sarah's film showed that the inquiry had reached very, very carefully cautious and convenient results for people, particularly those in the insurance industry and the oil industry. Once again, what I learned from Sarah's films, which she was kind enough to copy and send to me, was that there was this constant covering up of difficult truths in society, particularly British society. And what happened to have an inveterate visitor to bookshops and second-hand bookshops, and I came across a novel called The Black Tulip, Alexander Dumas, the Frenchman, which I'd never really heard of. And I got this novel. It had a long introduction, which stated as a fact that prior to the treaty and the Acts of Union, there had been all sorts of scandals going on. And I thought, that can't be the case. Corruption stops at Dover and starts again somewhere off the in the Atlantic Ocean, because this is a perfect society where we have things regularized and people know their rights. And I'm reading this introduction with the growing sense of alarm, because it says that when David Hume, the philosopher, was writing his history of England, there were bits he deliberately left out. And I thought, he would not David Hume. Sure, not after all, Robert Louis.
decided to check up a bit. I did that at the National Library of Scotland in Edinburgh. And as you go to the National Library of Edinburgh, you pass a statue on the left of David Hume. Somewhat inappropriately dressed for a Scottish winter or even a Scottish summer. He was in a toga. Quite quiet. Maybe he did yoga, the sculptor was doing before. But it turns out actually that Mr. Hume did indeed leave certain things out of his history of England. And I've carefully copied down the page references to the 1789 edition of his history. Page 189, he said, "There are many indignities too shocking to be recited." Well, one of those indignities might just be our sovereign status and our ability to use the courts, in theory at least. As a result of this, reading this, by the way, it comes out Alexander Dumas was a black man, strongly anti-racist black man. I thought he was a white Frenchman, since I was a kid when all of these books. Turns out he's a black man. Anyway, the author of this introduction said that before the man who was to become King William became King William and was important from Holland and what was universally known as the Glorious Revolution, particularly talk about the Glorious Revolution in places like RSNH and Winnick's Castle. I'm sure it makes our food taste better, or made their food taste better. He says that William was involved in murdering two brothers. Not King Harry, our hero. So I checked that out and it turned out, yeah, he was. And furthermore, he and his acolytes did something else which had a very profound influence in Scotland. They organised the massacre at Glencoe. This was not just some weird, clannish feud. This was a deliberate atrocity that was committed against our people. And having got to know Sarah a bit better, I never start checking up on her when we get to these. Might well be right about taking her out for her. Might well be right about the rain. But really, she got this one. So I was astounded when quite early on in this process I came across Simon Chalmers' History of Britain, where he has the following to say about, sorry, I'm going to read this out, it's not poetry, but go back. Describing the aftermath of Glencoe, he said, "There was an immediate outbreak of hand fluttering and pious professions of regret in London and Edinburgh, especially by those who directly or indirectly had actually been responsible for what was now called slaughter under trust. An obligatory inquiry was instituted at Holyrood House. The Scottish Parliament formally expressed its horror. Breadalbane and the Master of Stair became the scapegoats for what had been an entirely premeditated act of official murder." Now this paragraph grew my breath. "For all on this time accused and fatal stumbles, the dawn massacre in the heather floor of Glencoe, the Weeping Valley, anticipated the standard operating practices of the British Empire, to be repeated countless times over the next 2 centuries in America, Asia, and Africa. Backward people, so-called backward people." And here we are today. We have a backward person in number 10 Downing Street. Families no very backward, but coming forward with his hands. glories of the British Empire. Well, our little country is regrettably still tapped into that. And it may very well be that Sarah, by her persistence and her researches, has found another path to freedom. And I sincerely hope that's the case. And certainly all paths to freedom do not involve hurting or intimidating or bruising other people have to be explored. And they have to be explored very firmly. And they have to be explored in a very direct way. But as another Scot, who surprises me sometimes, the author of Peter Pan reminds us that our temper is a blade that must be held in our hand. We have to always behave in a dignified, courageous manner in the struggles that lie ahead. We don't want a civil war. We don't want all sorts of people to suffer unnecessarily. We are about trying to relieve the awful suffering that's been inflicted on people, even in our own time, completely unnecessary austerity following the 2008 bank crisis, where we ended up spending hundreds of billions of pounds to shore up banks that still aren't shored up properly, are still conducted by people who extract uncanny bonuses from their dubious work. So, we are where we are, and we're in a very interesting place. And I thank Sarah deeply for all her effort she has made. I'm going to end in a minute, you'll be glad to know. I should of course mention that there's something else going on in our lives. The very system that was supposed to bring us untold bounty, the system of petrochemical capitalism, is in a very, very, very delicate state. It is destroying the planet. And each of us in some way has been habituated to think that we must always be part of the system. I think we've come to a point where I listened to a talk the other day where a woman psychiatrist was talking about what's happening to our youngsters, how fearful some of them are becoming because of the ecological crisis, how they live in a world of dread when at the age of 15, 16, 17, 18 to the wasting that longer to grow. We are in a profound crisis, and anybody who can show us a way that is kind and humane out of it is someone who gets my thanks and admiration. I promise you I will close with a wee poem too. I want to read you a wonderful poem from the great American feminist poet, Adrienne Rich, a poem called Natural Resources. She concludes the last bit of the poem. My heart is moved by all I cannot say. So much has been destroyed. I have to cast my lot with those who, age after age, perversely, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world. By those people, she means ordinary people who are also extraordinary people, who stand up for human rights, who want to protect animals and the environment, and want their children to grow up, and their grandchildren to grow up in a world that is kind and helpful and fair, and where there's equal distribution of power, not the horrendous architecture of the hierarchy. There's them, and then there's all of us. So, to finish with two very short statements from Robert Burns. He incidentally visited this area when he was, I think the Karen works was something of great interest to him. Robert Burns has two wonderful sayings that I keep with me in my little book when I feel a bit funny and I delve into this wee notebook and remind myself how wonderful life is. Robert Burns says, the heart which is generous and kind most resembles God. Well, I'm not a big believer in the sky, but this is a Sunday, and maybe that makes it more acceptable. The other thing he says, according to the program for the Edinburgh Festival, a show called Burn is being put on. But he said, and still my motto is I dare. Thank you.
And of course, every one of us going to get behind the campaign to get our freedom from this oppressive union, either through a referendum or through a plebiscite election. But wherever that road leads and however that turns out, what we can know is that today, in this place and on this stage, we here are making history. Because today we launched a campaign to reclaim Scotland's constitution. Over the last few weeks, we've actually heard a lot more about it than we have for some time. We have heard politicians speak of the sovereignty of the Scottish people. Ian Blackford, Alan Smith, and Nicholas Sturgeon speak about the claim of rights. What they might be forgiven for thinking is that what the sovereignty of the Scottish people means under the Scottish constitutional law is that we have the right to vote for the kind of government that we want. That is not sovereignty. That is just democracy. That is supposed to be what's in place across the UK. That is what is enshrined in the UN Charter of Nations. The right of the people to decide on and vote for the kind of government that they want. Sovereignty, popular sovereignty, is the right to enforce democracy. And that's a very big difference. It comes with a lot more, but we'll get to that. So, when it comes to a referendum or a plebiscite, we have to consider whether we are looking at any kind of democracy. If we take the last referendum, which was controlled by a foreign power, who broke the agreements and terms it had made for the fairness of that referendum and ignored all international conditions which
set the terms for a free and fair referendum, and having done that, declared that the result it had skewed publicly, let alone dodgy postal votes or switched boxes of ballots, that the result of that skewed vote was binding when it had been a purely consultative referendum. What kind of democracy were we seeing in action there? Let alone sovereignty. A plebiscite election, we're going to be facing the same problem. We're going to be facing the problem that a foreign power which controls the electoral roll, the voting mechanisms, the media, and will set the conditions, will step in to skew any result in exactly the same way. And we cannot comfort ourselves that if we don't get it this time, we can go for a plebiscite after that, or the one after that. Because when our politicians, quite rightly, invoked the sovereignty of the Scottish people, what they were saying to Westminster was, in Scotland, the people have a right to say what they want to the government and to be heard. We know that that is different from what happens in England, where, under the doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty, the Parliament tells the people what to do and tells them what rights they can and cannot have. And that is the ground on which they have the right to declare an election, a plebiscite on independence. In fact, they have the obligation to find out what the people want and put that into effect. That does not exist under parliamentary sovereignty. But this may be the very last election where it will be possible for the Scottish Government to say that to Westminster. Because waiting in the wings is a brand new Act of Union, which will replace the treaty and all its provisions and the existing Acts of Ratification, which they call the Acts of Union. And Section 38 of the EU Withdrawal Bill makes parliamentary sovereignty the law across the UK for the first time, replacing the sovereignty of the Scottish people. In other words, the British establishment, which has had Scotland in a prison for 300 years, is getting ready to lock the door and throw away the key. We need a miracle. But fortunately,
we have one. It is a homegrown Scottish miracle called the Claim of Right Act of 1689. The Claim of Right Act is the only UK constitutional document which states that there exists, quote, a fundamental constitution, and it sets out the principles, provisions, and rights that are contained in that constitution. Why didn't we know about it before? That's a long story, and one that I'll say is better than I can. How we know about it now is the reason that I'm here. In 2008, the records of the Parliament of Scotland were restored and published online. And when that happened, the full text of the Scottish Act of Union, the Act of Ratification, was also published. And in the Scottish version was something of the treaty, of the Union, and of the continuation of the Union. If you haven't read it, I suggest you do. That condition is that inserted into the treaty, to be ratified, along with the articles of the treaty, is a Scottish Act, passed in 1706, which contains a number of previous acts passed to preserve the Scottish religion and the Scottish Constitution. The only named act was the Claim of Right. It was understood at that time that the Claim of Right was Scotland's constitutional document. It had been used as its constitutional document just a few years earlier, when good old King Billy the Orange, author of the Glencoe Massacre, decided that he did not want the Scottish people to present a legal petition on behalf of the Darien project. He tried to have that right to petition removed, but he was stopped. The right to petition is one of the rights that is enshrined in the Claim of Right Act of 1689. When the Scottish Privy Council and Parliament blocked him from doing that, he began moving his faction, the court faction, to get the Claim of Right rescinded, or altered, or rewritten. The Scottish Parliament responded by putting together a bill which was passed a year after he died. And
that bill made it high treason. High treason to attempt to alter or amend or subvert the Claim of Right, or to criticize it, either in writing or in speech.
a constitutional document that limited the power of government and gave the right to people that could not. So there you have it, at least the bones of our beautiful Scottish Constitution. So, here is what we can do. We call on our Parliament to recognise that popular sovereignty means what it says. To acknowledge that under the Scottish Constitution, they and Westminster are subject to the people of Scotland. And we call on our Scottish Government to remind the British Government that it has already acknowledged this fact. Now it is a matter of abiding by it. We demand that they at least recognise that there is no such thing as popular sovereignty in Scotland, separate from and without the principles and provisions of the Claim of Right Act of 1689. There's a saying that a woman doesn't get a little bit pregnant, and a people cannot be a little bit sovereign. So we call on our government to restore the rightful instruments of popular sovereignty, which include the right to veto, to sanction, and for redress, including removal of a despotic and a tyrannical government. We do not demand the power to legislate, or to replace the Scottish Government as the executor of national governance. We don't need to do that. We demand the means established under our ancient and continuous Constitution to declare what is unlawful in Scotland to be unlawful in Scotland. That requires a jury. It requires a tribunal. It doesn't need an election and it doesn't need a franchise. We have a clear set of rules, we have a clear set of charges. All we need is the Convention of the Estates to make the charges. We demand, therefore, the right and the means established by our Constitution and by statute to declare that those who have been loaned the power of the Scottish people to govern this country are in violation of our constitutional law under the terms of the Claim of Right Act, which defines the sovereignty which they've already acknowledged, under the guarantee which presently remains the standing condition of the Union, that the Claim of Right Act continues in Scotland or the Union does not. We demand the right to recall the Convention of the Estates, the jury of the people, to reinstate the right of the people to participate in, advise, instruct or veto any government on matters that relate to the common good, to the rights and liberties of the people as set out in the Scottish Constitution and enacted from 1210 up to the Union. The right to protect our people from greed, corruption and oppression. The right to keep our politicians honest and our government accountable. And our laws and policies directed by the primacy of the common good. And the right of that constitutional provision to say to Boris Johnson and his cronies, to the vultures who have made obscene profits from the resources that belong to all of us, on behalf of every hungry Scottish child, every desperate Scottish parent, every frantic and impoverished pensioner, on behalf of our homeless, our sick and our disabled, and on behalf of a future Scotland where none of that will ever happen again, where no bombs are made and exported to blow up the children of Yemen and Syria. And where no poisonous chemicals drive an extinction event in our time. To say to the British establishment,
to the British government in Scotland. Your day here is done. Your rule of law is lawless, arbitrary, dishonest, elitist, pitiless, inhuman, and unlawful in Scotland. No matter if it wears ermine or silk or judges' wigs, or it hee-haws from the front benches of what is called the Mother of Parliaments. Our law is different. It is not yours to override, overrule, or overturn, and it never was. Nor does it belong to Westminster, nor does it belong to the Scottish Government, nor to the Scottish courts. It belongs to the people. Our Constitution is held in trust by and for our people, from our ancestors and for our great-grandchildren. And what we ask now is that our Scottish Government gets behind the people, so that we can get behind them. That under our Scottish law, we do reconvene the Convention of the States. We do not need an election, we do not need a franchise, we need the will of the Scottish people. We need that tidal wave of public opinion behind us. And when that is done, and when the charges have been considered and the rules of our Constitution have been compared against the many, many, many crimes that have been committed against our people and our nation, we need the public support that will surely rise to echo the guilty verdict. And when that verdict has been given, and the proper lawful consequence under the Scottish Constitution, which is that we depose the tyrannical, arbitrary and despotic government, has arrived, I suggest that then is the time that we consider a referendum. Not on whether to leave the Union, but on whether we want to join it. Because by default, we will have sacked this arbitrary, despotic and tyrannical government. And those are the words of the Claim of Right Act of 1689. Thank you.
Thank you. popular sovereignty means what it says. To acknowledge that under the Scottish Constitution, they and Westminster are subject to the people of Scotland. And we call on our Scottish government to remind the British government that it has already acknowledged this fact. Now it is a matter of abiding by it. That they at least recognise that there is no such thing as popular sovereignty in Scotland, separate from and without the principles and provisions of the Claim of Right Act of 1689. There's a saying that a woman doesn't get a little bit pregnant and a people cannot be a little bit sovereign. And so we call on our government to restore the rightful instruments of popular sovereignty, which include the right to veto, to sanction, and for redress, including removal of a despotic and a tyrannical government. Please understand, we do not demand the power to legislate or to replace the Scottish Government as the executor of national governance. We don't need to do that. We demand the means established under our ancient and continuous Constitution to declare what is unlawful in Scotland to be unlawful in Scotland. That requires a jury. It requires a tribunal. It doesn't need an election and it doesn't need a franchise. We have a clear set of rules. We have a clear set of charges. All we need is the Convention of the Estates to make the charges. We demand, therefore, the right and the means established by our Constitution and by statute to declare that those who have been loaned the power of the Scottish people to govern this country are in violation of our constitutional law under the terms of the Claim of Right Act, which defines the sovereignty which they've already acknowledged, under the guarantee which presently remains the standing condition of the Union, that the Claim of Right Act continues in Scotland or the Union does not. We demand the right to recall the Convention of the Estates, the jury of the people, to reinstate the right of the people to participate in, advise, instruct, or veto any government on matters that relate to the common good, to the rights and liberties of the people as set out in the Scottish Constitution and enacted from 1210 up to the Union. The right to protect our people from greed, corruption, and oppression. The right to keep our politicians honest and our government accountable. And our laws and policies directed by the primacy of the common good. And the right of that constitutional provision to say to Boris Johnson and his cronies, to the vultures who have made obscene profits from the resources that belong to all of us, on behalf of every hungry Scottish child, every desperate Scottish parent, every frantic and impoverished pensioner, on behalf of our homeless, our sick and our disabled, and on behalf of a future Scotland where none of that will ever happen again, where no bombs are made and exported to blow up the children of Yemen and Syria and Iraq. And where no poisonous chemicals drive an extinction event in our time. To say to the British establishment, to the British government in Scotland, your day here is done. Your rule of law is lawless, arbitrary, dishonest, elitist, pitiless, inhuman, and unlawful in Scotland. No matter if it wears ermine or silk or judges' wigs, or it hee-haws from the front benches of what is called the Mother of Parliaments. Our law is different. It is not yours to override, overrule, or overturn, and it never was. Nor does it belong to Westminster, nor does it belong to the Scottish Government, nor to the Scottish courts. It belongs to the people. Our Constitution is held in trust by and for our people, from our ancestors and for our great-grandchildren. And what we ask now is that our Scottish Government gets behind the people, so that we can get behind them. That under our Scottish law, we do reconvene the Convention of the Estates. We do not need an election, we do not need a franchise, we need the will of the Scottish people. We need that tidal wave of public opinion behind us. And when that is done, and when the charges have been considered and the rules of our Constitution have been compared against the many, many, many crimes that have been committed against our people and our nation, we need the public support that will surely rise to echo the guilty verdict. And when that verdict has been given, and the proper lawful consequence under the Scottish Constitution, which is that we depose the tyrannical, arbitrary, and despotic government, has arrived, I suggest that then is the time that we consider a referendum. Not on whether to leave the Union, but on whether we want to join it. Because by default, we will have sacked this arbitrary, despotic, and tyrannical government. And those are the words of the Claim of Right Act of 1689. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I please give a round of applause to introduce Ian Lawson.
Thank you. My name is Ian Lawson, and I've brought my own sound system, which is my voice. It's sitting in good stead. It takes a lot of production for you to get a voice like this. But first of all, my thanks for the kind invitation to come along and speak at what I think is a very important event, which has the potential to be the most important announcement made in the last 7 days. I thought that would get your attention. Well, I've good reason for saying that, because for the last 30 years or so, I've lived the bulk of the time off and on visiting Estonia, a country which became independent in 1991. And I want to tell you about when I arrived there, a bottle of, well, I missed my hotel breakfast, that's the first thing that happened. I had to go in and pay for it myself, and I got 2 boiled eggs, 2 slices of toast, a cup of tea, and the bill came to 7p. So me and all my pals, we had the 14th floor in this hotel, and we're up on the left, knocked every door and said, listen lads, it's not absolutely crucial. We made the hotel breakfast every morning. But at that time, 30 years ago, the average wage in Estonia was the equivalent of $40 a month. And here we are 30 years later, and it's the most digitally advanced nation in Europe, probably the world, and living standards have soared right across the board. Now, I don't want to talk about that tremendous success today. I want to talk about I know it's a well-known fact that it was a key catalyst to the success in bringing independence to Estonia. And the reason I want to speak about it is because it bears an uncanny resemblance to what the SSRG and Salvo are trying to do here in Scotland. Like Scotland and Estonia, there was various parties all supporting independence, one bigger, by the way, than all the rest. But they were very unwilling to listen to new ideas. And there was a real fear that the whole independence campaign would stall. And just at that moment, that crucial moment, a new organisation arose called the Estonian Heritage Organisation. And it was, for a time, basically that, a cultural and historical group. But when Glasnost arrived in Estonia, it suddenly decided it should look at a historical document. Not a claim of right, but the non-aggression pact signed between the Soviet Union and Germany 1 month before the Second World War started. And when they did their research on this, they discovered there were secret protocols in that agreement, which carved out and annexed the 3 Baltic nations, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and a slice of Poland to the Soviet Union, and the rest to Nazi Germany, and the rest of Poland to Nazi Germany. But what the historical and political significance of this was they were now able to prove that Russia's invasion and takeover of Estonia wasn't an act of protection against aggression from outside, but was in fact the result of a dirty deal between Russia, the Soviet Union, and the Nazis. So when they invaded, that was just one of these special military operations that Russia fulfilled for over a long period of time. But that was very crucial, and the political point was, if the Soviet Union invasion of Estonia at the Second World War was illegal, then that must mean that Estonian citizenship, legal Estonian citizenship, granted from the first period of Estonian independence after World War I, must still exist. And that is crucially important. So what the Estonian Heritage Organisation did, they set up, I think from memory, 1,100 branches across Estonia. And they started signing up people in Estonia as citizens, not of the Soviet Union, but of an independent Estonia. And when they started doing this, the communists trying to scare people, described the little coupon that they were issuing to people once they signed up. They described them as tickets to Siberia. And they could have been tickets to Siberia for the first few thousand people. But 8 months later, they were able to announce that more than 50% of the population of Estonia had signed up to the Estonian citizenship. Citizens. And shortly after that, 2 big events, very famous events. The first one was the Singing Revolution. Hundreds of thousands of people singing in defiance of the Soviet Union. And you can stop 100 people singing illegal songs. You can stop thousands. You can't stop hundreds, thousands of people. And the Estonians done that. And then there was the famous Baltic chain, which I don't know if you've all heard about. It's when Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, total population 7.5 million, decided they would hold hands from Tallinn right through the length of Estonia, right through the whole of Latvia to the capital of Vilnius in Lithuania. 600 kilometres, 2 million people. Now, it attracted, worldwide attention. Quite stunning. But what that did was it emboldened the politicians. The fact that over half the population had signed up, the fact that they were having these, just incredible demonstrations. The politicians who had been divided up then became united. And as the tanks rolled in the streets of Tallinn in the August when they attempted to remove Gorbachev, the Estonian parliament voted for independence. And the world accepted it. They recognised that this freedom that was due. So really tremendous to be involved in that. Now, of course, was the Estonian consul here in Scotland for 15 years, so I've met many of the key leaders in that particular organisation. And it's no surprise that many of the Estonian heritage organisations were elected to the first independent Estonian parliament, including the Prime Minister, Mark Lahr. So Sarah, you got to look out, you might get a new job, really shortly. Now, I tell you all about this because as sure as nightfall is day, the professional politicians are going to downplay and poo-poo everything you do. And there's good reason for that, because you're opening up new territory that they don't control. And that's very, very scary for them. But it should make you all the more determined. If you look at the criticism the First Minister got last week for not making more of the claim of right argument, let's face it, that couldn't have happened a year and a half, 2 years ago. That happened in the election. That happened was a reflection of the education that's already sprung from this organisation, to which you give massive credit because it's a great job that you've been doing. The independence, in my book, will come from the people of Scotland. It won't come from the devious political parties whose only involvement is based on what they can get out of what the party can get out of it. It needs all Scotland to get behind this. And Salvo is the ideal organisation that allows everyone from whatever political background, if they want to deliver independence for Scotland, this is the way. I worry about the partisanship of Scottish politics because, we need everyone. But it's difficult to maintain unity when people are at it. And they're at it already. I was appalled that Nicola Sturgeon could not stand up and say that every vote cast for a pro-Indy party would count as a vote. That is an absolute disgrace. We don't vote for Nicola Sturgeon, we vote for independence, freedom. It's important because we need independence, but we need justice as well. And God knows in the last few years, the need for justice in this country has been absolutely overwhelming. The false persecution of Alex Salmond is a national disgrace, both for our government and the justice system. The case against Craig Murray, who's just spoken here at Edinburgh, sitting next to me on the left here, there's also a issue where a judge couldn't even explain to the public the nature of the charge he faced. She said, that's okay, it's clear in my mind. This is the same woman who wants to stop jury trials for sex offence cases. That is not justice, nothing like it. Or where Mark Hurst, with Don Wade in his home, the seizure of all his electronic equipment, only to months later end up in the sheriff court where the sheriff's judgment was there was no case to answer. But he was out all the expense of his defence, while those who accused him, who incidentally were the same people who accused Mark Simon, accused Craig Murray, accused Mark Hurst, weren't out a penny because they were using the public prosecutor. Absolute scandal. Or, let's not leave anybody out here. What about the police? The 700 interviews, 400 of them face to face. How much did that cost? Absolutely corrupt. They were given an open-ended budget by the Crown Office, run by the ex-MI5 agent in charge. You know, we do not live in a fair and honest country at the moment, and that's what we've got to get out of. You know, it's okay when an independence for England, but we import and allow the same type of corruption here in Scotland. We will have one, nothing. I'm getting to the close because you must all be getting really hungry. Alice Gold is the pre-lunch speaker. Entertainment. I feel an earlier on, I may have to get up the bigger speaker. So, England boasts of its great unwritten constitution. No constitution should be unwritten. A constitution is meant to provide protection to its citizens. An unwritten constitution gives those in power a blank cheque to do whatever they like, whenever they like, to whoever they like. I believe we can have a great constitution. I believe in a faith in Salvo and the SSRG to deliver it. Scotland is a good country. It could be a great country. Not great in if it uses its power to subject other nations, but a great country because it can provide opportunity here for our sons and daughters, our grandchildren, and all future generations. I should join us. And well done, Sarah, for what you're doing.
Indeed, it's a great honour to have been asked to come and help host this and help us try and keep us on track, although I've completely failed at that so far. Anyway, we're going to break for lunch for approximately an hour, and then we'll come back, we'll try and get our fare. We've also, if you've got any questions, please try and think about them. We see you. Can we hear you?
Hello, David.
Ah, hey!
Hallelujah.
Before we get carried away, a few things I've learned about Alf Baird, because he joins most weeks the SSRG meetings. We've been meeting twice a week for the last 14 months, and sometimes. So we've lost a little bit of ourselves, and I think this is going to feed nicely into what Alf now wants to talk about. Is the title of what he wants to say is, who are we really? The colonised identity. Over to you, Alan.
Thank you, David. I do have some slides if you want to put them up, but you'd probably have to share the screen. If not, I can just carry on. Would you prefer me just to carry on?
Yes, just carry on.
Okay. Yeah, the title really is about who are we really, and this relates to the work I did in my research book, the Dún Huaden book. It's the socio-political determinants of Scottish independence. But the findings, the framework I developed on this suggested that the Scots were oppressed people, and many oppressed peoples, of course, seek liberation, which we know as independence, which many others also regard as decolonisation. So I just wanted to cover some of the parts of the framework I developed, including what gives us our identity, which is our culture and our language. Another part of it is colonialism, which can be obscured in societies after, certainly after 300 years. And then some discussion perhaps about institutions, then ethnicity. Ethnicity is important, as we'll see. But first on culture, well, culture really is our customs and beliefs, values, and values are very important. And this is all transmitted through language. What we know is cultural imperialism is what's is about promoting the culture and language of one nation and another. So what Scots are subject to is what I found in the research really is cultural imperialism. And cultural imperialism, that's the imposition of another alien culture on a people, enforces what then becomes a cultural hegemony. The ruling class, the ruling groups, the meritocratic elite adopt and hold to the culture of the imperial power, as it were. This is related to the theory of enculturation, Bourdieu's enculturation theory, where a different culture is imposed on a people. What the net result of this, of course, is the Scottish, what we know is the Scottish cultural cringe, which is a feeling of cultural inadequacy and even self-hatred. This is a psychological condition which we don't talk about very much, and I'm not surprised because its actual real scientific term is internalized racism or appropriated racial oppression. So what we have in Scotland is what the folk singer Dick Gaughan described as an illusion of culture, where we have an illusion of culture, which is a primary tool used by elites to retain power. What we should remember here is that culture and identity are very closely connected. And this is what gives people in Scotland a British identity in some cases rather than a Scottish identity. It's the impact and imposition of cultural imperialism. So independence in post-colonial theory is regarded as a fight for a national culture. And we should remember here that the desire for nationhood is a cultural emotion. And as Cambridge Analytica might remind us, people vote on the basis of emotion. And we should also remember that these values that we hold in relation to competing identities and cultures reflect the way we might vote. Rather than voting in what might be our best interest, we vote in relation to what our values, the values we hold. We then move to language, and all I can say here is the literature tells us that language and culture intersect to form our identity. And this is particularly important in the Scots language, which we'll cover again shortly. What we know is linguistic imperialism, which is related to cultural imperialism, seeks to marginalize and destroy indigenous language. The aim of linguistic imperialism is what is known as linguistic genocide. It's the linguicide or the death of a language. And the loss of language in imperialism or colonialism is intended to undermine the sense of identity and belonging of a people. And this relates to what the writer on Scots, Billy Kay, has described as the establishment's aim was to destroy the Scots language. And particularly, this is done through not teaching the Scots language in schools. So language policy of educational institutions in Britain and in the devolved administration seek to deprive Scots of the Scots language by not teaching it. In post-colonial literature, this reminds us of the statement by the great Kenyan writer Thiongo that the language of my education is not the language of my culture. The native tongue, of course, in this sense, is neither written nor read, and it leads to poor oral development, as David rightly described. And we're all subject to it. As soon as we go into primary schools, our braw Scots mither tongues driven out our heads. And that's the reality of cultural and linguistic imperialism. What we see within our society and our institutions is our entire bureaucracy hears and uses only what is known as the colonizer's language. So language, just to rephrase there, language participates, well, what it means really here is that the colonized or the oppressed people participate in two psychical and cultural realms. And here we have two tongues in conflict, Anglophone and Scots particularly. The colonized tongue in this scenario is the one that's least valued. It's not taught, it's regarded as invalid, it has no stature, it's discarded, which in a sense alienates the people who speak it still. Language really is the means by which humans claim diversity and define their identity, which is the serious side effect of this. Language is what defines and unites a nation. So when a language is deprived, it seriously affects the sense of belonging and identity of a people. Even the Open University has said that the Scots language is a crucial and integral part of Scottish culture and identity, the tragedy being that it's not taught to the bairns in school. Language is also what is known as determining national attachment. So writers on this are quite clear about the importance of language giving identity. Scots have, Billy Kay again, Scots have an identity with and loyalty to the Scots language, which is understandable, but a confusion and what Professor Tom Devine described as a dual persona, a confused national identity between British and Scottish. Language and culture is what gives us our national consciousness. And here we go back to post-colonial theory and also the reality in that peoples in self-determination conflict are always linguistically divided. And in Scotland's case, this is the British and Scottish scenario is the way the divide works and the way people vote. And that's related largely to our identity, which is influenced and determined also by culture and language. We then move to colonialism, which has not been discussed in the Scottish independence debate at all, which is a fascinating omission because the UN describes independence, self-determination as decolonization. So we should understand the reality and the rationale for independence, which is not about being a few quid better or worse off. It's, if we look at colonialism, we're then into the realms, and also in cultural and linguistic imperialism, we're into the realms of a mindset, a psychological condition. So colonialism basically involves external political control and economic exploitation. And my research and others' research has basically found that Scotland is very, very much subject to these two forces. External political control. We have no control over our membership of the EU, for example. We have no control about who we go to war with. We have no control over our lands and seas, our energy, or any really of our assets. Which can all be plundered and are plundered by international money now. The third aspect is settler occupation, which is beginning to accelerate in Scotland, but it's been a part of Scotland's demographics for a century and more, including the outmigration, in some cases forced or incentivized, of between 3 and 4 million Scots. And in colonialism, that is understood as what is known as banishment of the natives. And that is and was a policy of successive British governments. Within the Scottish context and UK, we also have what is known, the research on internal colonialism, where a country, an oppressed people live as an ethnic minority, live within a larger state. And here we have what research found is a cultural and ethnic division of labour favouring the Anglophone dominant group. And this includes also the native elites who take on the culture and language of the power. This also, internal colonialism leaves a nation and a territory, in this case Scotland, and also the Celtic periphery in the UK, Ireland and Wales, economically underdeveloped. The industry and the economies are subject to rather narrow specializations of industry, and there to really serve the mother country, which in this case is England, and its needs. So Scotland is not developed as it would be under independence. Because of this cultural and ethnic division of labour and economic underdevelopment, exploitation, lower GDP, lower trade, and so on, the rise, what we see is the rise of an independence movement, which reflects ethnic solidarity of Scots speakers. And this is well-known factor in international imperialism, colonialism, decolonization, and the reason why it reflects ethnic solidarity of Scots speakers is their oppression is ethnic oriented. We should remember that colonialism is always a cooperative venture with native elites, the bourgeoisie in particular, but also elements of the proletariat who benefit from colonialism, and they tend to operate in a cooperative manner with the dominant power. And we see this reflected also in elected majorities of nationalist MPs who do not or refuse to use their political sovereignty. In post-colonial theory, this is described as their petrification at the point of liberation. What Ian Lawson described about the Estonians was very important here, and in Estonia, one of the most important parts, apart from the cultural focus within the country and the songs and singing, it was also the political elite took control of the country at the right time with the right majorities and so on. We have to remember, though, that colonialism imparts a mindset on a people, and Albert Memmi, the great post-colonial writer, described this as a disease of the mind. Frantz Fanon continued with the same theme, saying colonialism empties the native's brain of all form and content. But essentially, the UN tells us through its decolonization committee C24 that self-determination independence is decolonization. We obviously believe that we have an equal party to a treaty-based alliance, which constitutionally we are. And as Sarah suggested, with a constitution that's been intentionally secreted away. But the reality is that pretty much all colonies, whether British, French, Russian, or whatever, had treaties of some form, but were all often violated. Just a brief word on institutions. Because we have a cultural and linguistic domination by another culture, as it were, Scotland is controlled by an Anglophone unionist establishment. A meritocratic elite reflects this cultural division of labour in the internal colonial model. We also have, reinforcing this, educational and socio-cultural segregation, and I refer particularly to private schools and also to elite universities, where elite universities have a focus on private school intakes for the more privileged classes, and also from the rest of the UK. And also this is basically reflected in the meritocratic elite. Most of the people governing and running our institutions are from this group that reflect the socio-cultural segregation of the society that we live in. So what eventually happens with this is that cultural division is built on socio-linguistic prejudice. There is a prejudice clearly against the Scots language, and the social exclusion occurs then of ethnic Scots speakers. The problem this gives to any colonial society, if you like, is it always ends up with a mediocre meritocracy. So we see institutions making terrible mistakes. It's largely because the meritocratic elite is drawn from a relatively narrow part of society, and also from the mother country. But essentially what this means is that discrimination becomes institutionalized throughout the country. This has adverse health impacts for cultural and economic underdevelopment, leading to social inequalities and poverty, a schizoid personality and alienation, depression and anxiety, and adverse health impacts. The former Chief Medical Officer of Scotland, Sir Harry Burns, likened health conditions of certain groups within Scotland to be similar to Aborigine peoples, and described this as being due to their cultural dislocation. Under cultural imperialism, the indigenous native culture is broken and suspended. But essentially also under economic underdevelopment, and we can say here that Scotland is underdeveloped compared to many other European and other countries. Our infrastructure as well is underdeveloped. And this economic underdevelopment in internal colonialism or colonialism parallels linguistic underdevelopment. So here we should remember that culture and language is very, very important. I just want to briefly go on to the subject of ethnicity. It's not something that has been discussed in the independence debate, but we should remember that imperialism and colonialism involves ethnic discrimination of native speakers and their culture. They're not teaching our language, they're not valuing our language, so they didn't value our folk, and that's the outcome of that. And this relates, well, colonialism and certainly cultural imperialism involves basically racism. And we should remember that, and remember also that the Scots are an ethnic minority within a UK context seeking self-determination. The Union, which is basically cultural domination, created the Scottish cultural cringe, which is a psychological condition. This ethnic discrimination becomes normalized in such a society, but essentially it limits personal and intellectual freedoms. This is why only 10% of the academics in universities, our universities, are Scots, and more than half the teachers in many of our schools are not Scottish. The Scots are basically not part of the professional and managerial class as they would be in an independent Scotland. We would not be advertising all our best jobs in London anymore, just as Denmark doesn't advertise all its best jobs in Berlin, as it might have done at one time. Or Estonia advertising all its best jobs in Moscow. But essentially what this means is imperialism, colonialism, ethnic discrimination of native communities and speakers and depriving them of their language leads to what we know as the Scottish cultural cringe, but what I've described is the psychological condition known as internalized racism, which is also known as appropriated racial oppression. And this is where the people appropriate negative stereotypes about them. The stereotypes of the Scot, as we know, are well established in the media, TV, and so on. Subordination and deprivation is then considered by that oppressed group to be deserved. The oppressed group then devalue their own group and adopt patterns of thinking which support maintaining the status quo. The oppressed group members then also seek conformity with the oppressor group culture, which means essentially casting off their own language and culture. So this is what ethnic identity culture, what happens is that what is known in post-colonial literature is cultural obliteration due to linguistic and cultural imperialism. What we can also say about this is this condition, high levels of appropriated racial oppression, which can be measured scientifically, probably, we might hypothesize, explains why many ethnic Scots still oppose independence. They still oppose their own liberation, unlocking the gate or the chain around their neck. They do this because of high levels of appropriated racial oppression. So there is a scientific explanation. And this goes back to the values adopted. Once people become assimilated into another culture, they adopt the values of that culture and cast off the values of their own culture and ethnic group. And this means that it's very difficult to convince people that they are going to be better off because through independence, because people will vote on the basis of their values rather than necessarily what is better for them. Just a brief word on history. Sarah mentioned what happens to our history with our constitution, but history is a very important part of colonialism and cultural imperialism. The colonial system depends on, as J.P. Sartre said, debasing the colonized. This means devaluing any pre-colonial history, and it takes on a dialectical significance in that sense. the values of the colonizer are what is sovereign in the territory, and they are, in this sense, the colonizer is the custodian of the values of civilization and history. And here the colonizer endeavors to falsify the native history. It's basically a fraudulent activity, but it's designed to extinguish memories, according to Albert Memmi. The colonialism then distorts and seeks to distort and disfigure and destroy the past of an oppressed people, to take away their past, to take away their history. In addition, the colonized, assimilated in this, the assimilated colonized group, if you like, the bourgeoisie in particular, joins in this process by intentionally hiding his past and traditions as if embarrassed by them. So in a sense, the colonizer extols only the qualities and history of the mother country in this sense. And the history which is taught in the territory is not the native's history. He and his land are non-entities in his own land, if you like. The colonized here is out of the game and no longer a subject of history. And as Gareth Wardell, Grousebeater, rightly said, alienation is reinforced in the teaching of what he described as bunkum native history. So to be no longer frustrated by history, the people's alienation has to cease. Just a quick point about language. The people in decolonization, the first thing people grasp is usually their rusted tongue. In our case, that's the Scots language largely. And so the most urgent claim of a group about to revive is the liberation and restoration of its language, according to Albert Memmi. The crushing of the colonizer here is included amongst the colonizer's values. So we have to remember, in this cultural and linguistic imperialism is about crushing the colonized group, in our case, the Scots speakers. We're torn away from our past and cut off from our future. And that's the colonial condition, which cannot be adjusted to. It can only be broken. The chain round the neck has to be broken. Recovering our autonomy and separate destiny, we immediately go back to our own tongue, our mother tongue, as Billy Kay would rightly say. And this self-recovery, for full self-recovery from this oppression, the oppressed has to find the tool with the shortest path to the soul, which is the language, because it comes from the soul. So our own mother tongue comes from the soul, whereas the other language we have imposed of us, I goes in, yin lug and out the other. So regaining possession of himself, passionately demanding the return of his language, which is essential for self-recovery. Just to conclude then, self-determination, independence, if you're looking for an explanation of what independence is, according to the UN, it is decolonization. And pretty much all the countries that have become independent through the UN self-determination process have decolonized. The UN describes colonialism and imperialism as a scourge. That's a form of punishment leveled at people, which is not just the theft of the resources and the plunder of their economies, it's also the removal of their culture and their language and their very soul, if you like. National liberation is really then the ending, and independence is the ending of ethnic oppression, colonialism being racism against a culture and the people, making it invalid and not respecting it. So it's an ending of ethnic oppression, and also economic, political, cultural, and linguistic oppression and exploitation. So just to conclude, independence movements are dependent on national consciousness, and this has always been the case. And the basis of national consciousness, whether it's Kenya, India, Ireland, or Scotland, is indigenous languages and culture. Imperialism seeks to obliterate native culture, language, and history. This leads to external and internalized racism, the colonial mindset, which has to be removed through liberation. Independence movements therefore reflect the solidarity of an oppressed ethnic group. And this has to be the case because their oppression is ethnically directed. So this means that the problem we have is that anti-nationalists are are known in colonialism as colonizers, but also native elites and others who adopt the colonizer values and mindset. And peoples in self-determination conflict, including Scotland, will always be linguistically divided. And there's no way to get around that. Independence is then a choice between between liberation or cultural assimilation. And that means that independence is ultimately, according to Frantz Fanon, a fight for a people's national culture, national self-recovery. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Al. I think part of what is commented on, I wondered out in this audience, how many people think these were positive roles on our television? 2 comedy series at the BBC, pumped out for years. Still Game and Rabsy Nisbet. Now, I used to think they were quite funny, but I now realise what it was really doing was painting Scotland as a bunch of alcoholic unemployed and 2 old gits who lived in a high-rise flat. Not a very positive image, is it? And I doubt that was an accident. So, thank you very much, Al. We are going to have some question and answer now, but I'm going to hand over first to Eileen. I keep getting it wrong. Can I just say, I'm obviously going to have to leave Scotland after we become independent, because I don't know any Scots language. So I don't fit in at all.
Hi again, everyone. Thank you very much for these patience. We're all down to get away and spread the word. I hope you are anyway. We're getting towards the end, and we're going to, first of all, have a short breakout session where I'm going to ask you to break into groups. You probably remember when you actually came into the building today, we asked you which part of Scotland you'd travel from. And that was just to ask you to discuss with each other within the group how you're going to take the message forward in your group, if you've got any ideas. Yes, we can. But before we do that, I'm just going to ask, are there any questions that you would like answered in relation to what we've just seen?
Yeah. We have. Right, Al, I hope you've not dashed off, because we do have some questions for you. It's on?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, that question was, can we get the backing of the United Nations to help us decolonize Scotland?
Yes, I've been in touch with the United Nations about this, and the response I had was that, yeah, you can be listed as a country for decolonization, which has a right then to independence, and that requires a member state to propose Scotland, and I assume other countries to agree to it. So, yeah, there should have been, in my view, there should have been a conscious move by the Scottish government and ministers of the Constitution to lobby and meet with the UN, and perhaps even have a permanent delegation at the UN, because the decolonization process is pretty much an automatic recognition that a people, a defined people, as well as the territory, but primarily a defined people, have a right to self-determination and independence. And in this regard, it's very important to remember that a defined people is very strongly considered in the context of its heritage, its culture, its language, as well as other attributes, its history, and indeed common suffering. So Scotland has all these attributes, but it's very surprising that the Scottish government hasn't made made approaches to the United Nations as an alternative means of independence, liberation, because it is a high priority, particularly as the situation continues in the current with the current the problems that we are facing, with a large number of people wanting independence and still a large number not. But we essentially, what my research found is that trying to understand the rationale for why Scots in particular vote against their own liberation. And this is, we find this through analysis of post-colonial theory.
Thank you. Have you got any more questions? You've got a question there and a couple in the middle of the room. Let's hope the wireless works that far. We'll soon find out. Should be on. No, hold on. Try again.
Oh, hi. I'm John. Thanks very much for opening the constitution on initiative. Could I ask you, what's post-colonial theory suggests steps to find one question?
Thanks very much for
Thanks
very much for expounding on post-colonial theory for the constitutionally uninitiated like myself. Could I ask you very simply, what does post-colonial theory suggest about what are the first steps to emancipation for a country that's been colonised for, as you say, 300 years? What would you recommend be our first step, second step, and if we've got time, maybe the third step? Thanks.
Yeah, is that a question to me, David? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think what post-colonial theory tells us is that the people, even at this stage, have in some cases, quite a rudimentary understanding of what independence means. So there is a need to have a better understanding about what independence is and why it's essential. And in this, we really have to talk about aspects of imperialism and colonialism and exploitation and racism of ethnic minorities within the UK, which in this case is Scotland. I think the second thing is that post-colonial theory also tells us that where the people put all their trust in a dominant national party, the dominant national party tends to reach a cooperation with the imperial power and tends to then take the people up blind alleys and delays independence. And this template is playing out in Scotland at the moment. I would say that Scotland's actually in the decolonisation process. Devolution was part of previous referendums in the 1970s were part of that. The various mass signatures of the 1950s were part of that. So we've been in a decolonisation process for a long, long period, probably going back to the independence wars in 1745. So it's a very long process here. But essentially what post-colonial theory tells us is the dominant national party reaches a cooperation with the imperial power. It then takes the people up the blind alley and delays independence. The difficulty with colonialism is regarded, as I said, as racism, but at the root of colonialism in post-colonial theory is what is known as fascism. And this is what we see, as Ian Lawson described, is the people, or the independence movement, the real independence leaders, if you like, being attacked by the dominant national party, which has made an agreement with the imperial power. Now, that's a dangerous part of the process, because the people then have to create new national parties to liberate the nation, the people. And that's exactly what's happening. And this happened in many different African countries, never mind Europe. So what is happening in Scotland is exactly what has happened in many territories around the world, whether British or French, or even probably Russian or American. So we're seeing the same process work its way out. The people have to then understand that liberation is becoming a rapid priority, because as time goes on, things get worse, progressively worse. And there's also a very risky strategy by the dominant national party, because it's putting a lot of things at risk and creating additional problems. So the people really have to understand this reality and try to work it out. But basically, Scotland is following a well-established decolonization template.
Thank you, Alf. Interesting, because I've heard these comments sort of before. I've got another question up here. Have we got any questions from the online community? Which I understand.
Just a couple of statements saying thanks very much to Alf for the.
So thank you, Alf. You've got a fan club.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks come into the earlier speakers as well, whilst we're on, but you never take the phone up, so just let you know that. Thanks.
Good, good. Well, we do have one more here. And I was just going to point out, so one of the interesting things, I've heard this theory about most countries don't become independent, even though they have a national and large party that claims that they're going to deliver independence to their sole purpose. And that in fact, it's another event that actually triggers and delivers independence. And I believe that is actually our cost of, it's right now what we're living through, the cost of living crisis and our energy prices going through the roof, when in fact we're in the richest part of the United Kingdom when it comes to energy. Why has our prices gone up?
Just to ask, is he still there? Just to ask Alf, why do you think this administration and the last administration were so reluctant to promote Scottish culture history? Most people don't have a grasp of Scottish history in the fullest sense. And if you don't have a history, it's very difficult to have your future if you feel you don't belong here, or you don't fully recognize what your culture and your history actually is.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that. All I can say is that the meritocracy that we have, or the cultural hegemony, has no interest in Scottish culture. So the people running government departments, bodies and so on, the reason why we don't teach the Scots language is actually very few of them have any interest in it. And we recruit many of our senior people from outside Scotland. I knew this from universities as well, where 90% of my senior colleagues were not Scottish. They were mostly from south of the border. And we see this also in schools, as I mentioned, where in some regions of Scotland, 2/3 of teachers are from outside Scotland. So basically, in the post-colonial theory tells us that the meritocracy in this form of territory is largely not indigenous culture. It's of a different culture and values, and those from this country adopt the culture and values of the superior culture. And this is what is the racist element in cultural imperialism, is it elevates one culture, language, values above another. So it's protecting these. So the reason why there's no interest in Scottish culture, I think it was probably well put by the great Alistair Gray when he did his Settlers and Colonists famous essay, in that, yeah, we had I think at the time, a head of Creative Scotland appointed, another one from south of the border to head up Creative Scotland, who famously said he didn't know anything about Scottish culture, but he was keen to learn. so basically we're appointing folk that didn't have a clue about Scotland half the time, don't have a clue about Scottish culture, don't have a clue about Scots language or languages. And this is also what differentiates us from countries in the rest of the world, but particularly, say, Scandinavia, where if I was going for a job as an academic in Norway, I might have to know the Norwegian language as well as English. So we have we give no language authority to the indigenous language or languages in Scotland. There's no requirement for senior people, professionals, managerial class coming here to understand Scots and to understand the language. So therefore, that is part of cultural imperialism, because the indigenous people then have to adapt their language. So the wee wifey going to the doctor, or the wee laddie going to the school, or the unfortunate going before the judge or whatever, might have to adapt his language to that of the meritocratic elite or the cultural hegemony. So therefore, I think the answer to your question is our cultural hegemony has very little interest in Scottish culture.
Thank you, Al. Do we have any more questions before we move on? We've got one over there. Would you like to come down to the front and ask it? Makes life much easier. Our radio mics are cracked.
Thank you. This is a follow-up on the United Nations question. Once we achieve independence, what do you foresee being the implications for the United Kingdom as a whole, and more specifically for the United Kingdom's permanent seat on the Security Council?
I think that with respect, that's probably a question for Murray rather than for me. My background is more business research and organizational management and behavior. But yeah, I think all I can say is tremendous implications with Scotland. But I think there is a groundswell of opinion internationally that that Scotland has a good case for liberation. But the problem I found, a lot of my work was on transnational projects with people from all different nationalities, and very few of them, even in government bodies, had any notion of Scotland's role and relationship within the UK and constitution. No idea about the constitution. And as Sarah presented there, even the Scots have no idea about their constitution, really. It's all been secreted away, out the way, and out of sight and out of mind. So the international community don't really know much about Scotland. I think ultimately, though, the political class that we elect to represent us as nationalists have to understand the imperative for independence as a cultural factor above all else. And all I can say about post-colonial theories, I mentioned that the only options are liberation, cultural liberation, or cultural assimilation. And with the latter, it means that the people and nation eventually perish. So what we're doing is we're not just fighting for our culture, we're fighting for really our survival. And because all colonized peoples eventually perish, and in one form or another. And we have to understand that. So the imperative is to get there, but it's also to enable the people to understand the wretchedness in that sense, and to understand the predicament we're in better. And it's not, as I've said before, it's not a matter just about being a few quid better off, or in the union or out with the union. It's a much more important issue to do with that. But on the UN, I think I'd have to direct that question to people that have much more input into international diplomacy. All I would say is that international recognition is obviously important, but if people want to continue to buy Scotch whisky, I'm sure they should recognise Scotland pretty quick.
Thank you, Al.